Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji. Welcome to the next session of Avid Online. For those who are joining us for the first time, a special welcome to you. And so please refer to the chat box for more information on Avid Learning, our programs, and the work that we do. We've used these extraordinary circumstances 2020 has presented us and transitioned our program online. Our digital further learning campaign, Avid Online, was launched on the 1st of April 2020 and now is 11 months young. And through the course of time, we have curated and presented close to 240 programs, including our popular premiere series of the Mumbai Opera. As we work towards getting back to the old normal, we're committed to continuing to support the arts, maintain our connection with our creative community, and facilitate learning and continuous dialogue with our audiences. So, whether we continue online or transition to physical events or a hybrid mix of both, we stay true to our mantra, as always, that learning never stops. And this brings me to our evening session. To mark International Women's Day 2021, Avid Learning presents Capturing Time Through Photography, Media, Places, and People, a live session on how photography has the unique ability of depicting humanity's trajectory through time, featuring three leading female voices from the space. This program is one of the two celebrating this important Remembrance Day at Avid. We strive to celebrate women and their significant impact across the arts. Through our curatorial focus, we have spotlighted topics related to gender parity, women's empowerment, and featured prominent as well as young and up and coming female voices in our programs. To close the programming, we will feature female agency in art on March 11th, next Thursday. But back to this exciting discussion today, allow me to introduce our very impressive panel and give them a warm virtual welcome. Curator, author, and professor of video and TV production at Jamia University, Sabeena Gadihoke. Photographer and pilot, Janaki Subramanyam. Photographer, legacy advisor and founder, the India Memory Project, Anusha Yadav, who will be in conversation with curator, Alkazi Foundation of the Arts, Rahaab Allana. For more about this very distinguished panel, please refer to their bios that have been posted in the chat section. They were also emailed to you earlier in the day. This session will evaluate the photography's position and perspectives and track the technology innovations in the field. These speakers will also examine the culture around photography and how it has shifted from a labored physical process to being an instantaneous recorder of moments, happenings, places, and people. Please note the session will last 75 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A, where Rahab will be taking questions submitted by the audiences. So do keep posting those questions in our Q&A box throughout. On that note, thank you once again for tuning in. Over to you, Rahab, and look forward to a fascinating session. Thank you.
Thank you, Wasan. To begin with, I would like to thank the Avid team for putting this panel together and for the generous invitation to speak on this particular occasion. Before we begin, I'm very quickly going to share my screen so that I can just continue with the conversation, and maybe you can give me a heads up as to whether it's viewable. It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So to begin with, the subject or the thematic that was presented to us, captivating as it is, capturing time, I suppose contemplating the very subject of time, we, as in the panelists and I, spoke about setting ourselves in one sense free from a context, but also embedding ourselves at the same time directly in the present. I mean, which would enable us to look both forwards and I suppose to the past as well at the same time. The present, as we know, is flooded with the iconography of resistance, but also with the bludgeon of authoritarianism that is threatening with a vacuum of all sorts. Perhaps the age of the absent image is something I think about quite often, the removed image. the censored image. But by everything a generation does or undoes, and the vacuum that it may or may not threaten to leave behind, the absences or the erasures. I'm thinking now, of course, also of the exhibition that opened, I think, just a few days ago at Vadehra Art Gallery called Erasures, which is curated by Sushant Mandal. How can we also crystallize our links to the present by giving primacy to material objects, but also to technology? That is one of the asks of this panel. Through moments, let us say, that may hide in plain sight. That is, how can our investigations change the course of the present? How can we encounter and volunteer something new at this point of time? I'm trying to intimate here a very questionable parameter. A few days ago, a colleague and I were in conversation with art historian Jeffrey Batchen, and he spoke extensively about his new book, which was called Negative Positive. But before I get to that, when I was talking a little bit about how we might volunteer something new into the present, I know Sabeena is going to talk about this particular artist, Azadeh Akhlaqi. She's been a friend and a colleague for very, very long. But I found this image fascinating because one of what I suppose the idea that she presents to us is how images can be conditioned, how they can be fictionalized with the passage of time. But it sort of drew me back to another image, and I wonder whether Sabeena has seen this one. I found this absolutely fascinating to some extent, because it kind of brings to mind one particular Australian photographer. His name is Frank Hurley, and he was taking photographs during the First World War. And he used what he would call then photographic impressionist pictures. And this one itself is a composite, I believe, of 12 negatives. And I wonder whether images like these actually, in a way, influence the work of Azadeh. That's just something about a kind of transgenerational reverberation. I'm just going to find the image that I was looking for. So yes, negative positive is something that Jeffrey Batchen posits to us as an important history of photography. This book has just come out. And it suggests new ways of engaging with image making and asks why we consider that which is beyond our knowledge or experience, the so-called negative, and then once experienced, the sharing it with others as the only possible positive scale of gauging productivity. And hence, through certain binaries, what he calls dark and light, presence, absence, how can we constructively use the shared intelligence that may itself be indefinite and ever-changing, but how can we wield technology to do so, even though in the present it is often wielded against the sharing of a certain kind of intelligence? So as much as we find the need to articulate the current moment, what we may ask will be the nodes through which we gauge experiences. So how is it that with what is happening around us at the moment, what are the terms on which, what are the parameters, what are the vectors through which we might actually absorb this very given moment? Now, scholars and artists have been looking at engaging collectively on this idea of the emotional afterlife of an image. Because of the partitions, the uprootings, and the exiles that are taking place, and even in, let us say, the current populist reconfigurations that are erupting across the world, how can we articulate, how must we articulate and then question our allegiances, our affiliations, our entitlements? How do we acknowledge personally, socially, and then politically events that occur on the ground? Will we self-consciously be able to provide a revisionist counterstructure to various dominant streams like now? And what role does the image play today? How does pedagogy engage with this role play? So I was hoping that there would be several trajectories we draw upon. So self-conscious aesthetic modes, which I've just talked about with reference to Azadeh and then Hurley, are important ways to sort of think about this as well yet again. And they make us perhaps think outside conventional socio-historical trajectories. And I thought this is important. How do we place ourselves at the moment, but constantly shift our contexts? The subtle entanglements of memory and space, the blurring of taxonomies, the edicts of gaze, the rupture of identity, the coded modes of othering, and then, of course, the unstable politics of curating moments in time. And this is something that I refer to with kind of personal intimation. While reading another book recently called The Subjective Object, there was reference to in this book how there can never be one ruling singularity that conditions how and why any phenomena, photography too, can be strategized and displayed for future generations. One of the key theorizations of this handy publication rests on the idea that the decisions that we make, either to show or to withdraw material, maybe to censor material from the public, are not often synchronized with the very making of the object, right? It might not have been intended even for public reception. And hence it makes me question, how do these objects, these photographs, these images rather, live or outlive the very terms of their production? So just as how 19th century photographs, and we've seen so many of them from either the Alkazi collection and well into many, many other repositories, how do images of these kinds, devoid of people, demonstrate a form also, beautiful as they might be, of a kind of representational violence by visualizing absence, right? The archive too remains, and then will always remain, a partial vestige, and constantly needs patches of time and substance in an effort to make it whole, which itself is growing and will always remain incomplete. Now, of course, I'm throwing us back a little bit more into time, but I've always enjoyed looking at images like these ones. And this is, of course, taken from the Crystal Palace, the 1851 exhibition, sort of pioneering exhibition. And it sort of shows us already how in 1851 there was a kind of suffusion of images, right? The curator seems to be sitting in the right-hand side corner and seems to be a little bit consumed by this sheer surfeit. And I found that as much as we are consumed with images, it seems that they too were consumed by the coming of this new technology, which is now almost 200 years old. So I just found it a fascinating image to think about. Coming back to the present, one of the other vectors I would like to suggest about this kind of an absence, and I just take an example from the Alkazi collection, and this is one of our recent publications, 1528 by Rohit Saha. He won the photo book grant that we give out on an annual basis in 2017. It was a response to state interventionism in the Northeast, which also borders Myanmar. And if we think about Myanmar right now, of course, at this current moment, it needs all the support it can receive from an international community. This much we know. But what Rohit Saha tries to do through this compilation of images and documentation of official records exposing legal cases of those who have disappeared during fake encounters is to present to us a kind of montage of an uncertain present. It recalls for me another book called The War Primer by Bertolt Brecht. And what I found fascinating about that book, and of course his response was to the next World War, the Second World War, is that certain audio-visual noise created by the surfeit of images sometimes eclipses sense, sometimes can cause the erasure of a certain sensibility as well. It's to be thought about if we think about affect theory, if we think about what I was saying earlier, the emotional afterlife of images. So the book itself becomes an act of reconciliation. That's a question mark. Does it become a kind of meditation? It's certainly a mediation, but it's never a resolution. That is always deferred into the future in the books that we bring out. So I'm just going to share some images from an exhibition that I curated called Look Stranger for the Serendipity Arts Festival. And the reason I show this is because an immediate learning from recent events was an understanding of a very subconscious terrain in which images operate. And images also need to migrate. discursive, methodological, and real spaces in order to survive in history, right? They must survive as a hybrid. Will the three traditional coordinates, and I wonder whether it will come up in our talk today, of either the archive, of media, of display, of exhibitionary modes, by which art historical trajectories and also visual culture territories can be mapped, how will these coordinates continue to evolve past their conventional roles and meld into the trajectories of what we may call an inclusive image discourse, right? An image studies. It's a question mark. The archive is a body which does change as it too lives and then outlives the terms of its very inscription. And so when pitched against a global praxis at this moment, like media, like photography, can we then reframe our consideration of what cultural artifacts are in the present through unpredictable arcs they might make and convergences and juxtapositions we might make in the future? Will the purpose of an archive that outlives its originary content and intent, but continues to accrue meaning through association, what will that object end up meaning? How can we understand the present, which will be tomorrow's archive, if certain images are missing? And perhaps that sentiment, and I will end here with one small quote, as it were, that sentiment of how we encapsulate the missing was put together quite beautifully by Alexander Solzhenitsyn in just these 4 or 5 lines, a poem. And as you know, he was a Russian philosopher, theorist, also a political prisoner. So he says, I dedicate this, and by that he meant the poem that he was writing, to all those who did not live to tell it. And may they please forgive me for not having seen it all, not remembered it all, and for not having divined all of it. So I'll end my introduction over there. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. And with that provocation, perhaps, Sabeena, we'd like to begin with you. Those were the questions like I was trying to put forward about how we actually incorporate a raw sense of history and a raw sense of time through what is very sophisticated right now, and that is media, right? And whose story are we telling, and how does one tell this story? And so one of the refrains perhaps for this panel was to also think about where pedagogy is going and how pedagogy is engaging with practice at this very moment, at this very crucial moment, which is something that you referred to earlier. So with that, may I please invite you to give the first presentation.
Thanks very much, Rahab. So I want to start by thanking Avid Learning, Asad, Aisha, Rahab, and my co-panelists. I'm really looking forward to this. I've been looking forward to it. I'm going to try and look at all of you, but I might read, so you have to forgive me from time to time because I'm going to try and stay with time. And because Rahab talked about pedagogy, and I am a teacher primarily, I'll start with pedagogy, but I might actually then move off into something else. So I'm going to start with a question that was asked from a student in class recently. I was showing them an interview with India's first woman press photographer, Homai Vyarawala, who I had written a book on. And she had been talking about her discomfort. Aisha, can I have the first image? With this very famous photograph by Cartier-Bresson, where Nehru is standing between the Mountbattens. And if you could just view that picture. And, she says in the film, she says, it made Nehru look like a clown. And the student wanted to know why she had a problem with the photo. Now, my reply about Homai's practice, like always, focused on context and history. Homai photographed in a particular moment when photographers were heroes. This was a generation of press photographers who were guided by the euphoria of the moment. She believed in the dignity of her subjects. They were not like Cartier-Bresson. They were not part of Magnum. This was candid photography was not the flavor of the times, and so on and so forth. In short, basically what I said to her, what said to the student, was that we needed to look back at the past through the lens of the times in which these images were made. So in my presentation, I actually want to unpack this very theme, the times of photography, and how we could have several imaginations of the past through the present. This is especially important at a moment when we are constantly looking back because of nostalgia. But I'm sure that Anusha is going to address that much better than me, so I'm not even going to get into that. In my presentation, I want to discuss possible ways to travel between the times of photography. As a contemporary researcher who works on mid-century photography, I spent a lot of time tracking what is simply called the context of the times that draws from factual information. So, for instance, in the absence of available work on, let's say, domestic or amateur work, I would rely on other kinds of sources. For instance, I would look at, if we don't have, collections, I would look at, material like oral histories, maybe people remembering somebody were photographing in the family, references in literature, competitions in printed magazines, and so on, references to local clubs, and so on. A photo history approach will privilege context over aesthetic value or look at aesthetic value from the point of view of the times. So pictorialism, for instance, which has always been dismissed as a kind of an inferior form of photography in mid-century history, acquires importance because it was popular, even if it meant taking endless pictures of sunsets and sunrises and landscapes. On the other hand, what happens when we don't have much context, except a broad sense of the times? Is there some advantage to that? So by 2012, Homai Veeravala had passed away. And along with the Alkazi Foundation that now has her archives, we decided to have a show that mostly focused on her work for just 5 years, which was the work between 1937 and 1941, before she went to Delhi and she became a press photographer. Now, what I have to foreground here is that I had no memory aid. I did not know anything about many of them. And in this case, some of the pictures took on the possibility of a different kind of value. So, for instance, if you look at, and I'm going to show you two sets of images. If you look at this one, where, they may have been published as grainy images in a magazine, but of course, now we were looking at them, in these sepia tones, they were uncropped, we were looking at the entire negative, and we were looking at these images that looked entirely different. And we were also looking back, and what I want you to imagine is how one would look at this picture in a moment today when we are looking back at the radio as an object of nostalgia, because this is a different moment in time. So we are looking at the same moment of the past, but looking at it entirely differently. Or if we can have the next set of images, Aisha, this set of negatives of a man dressing up to be a woman. Was this for a theatre performance? Was it a rehearsal? We will never know, except for one fact, which I knew, that Homai did have a connection with Urdu Parsi theatre, as her father was an actor, and he did play the roles of women. How does this set of pictures, Aisha, can we have the next one, without any other available detail about its context, stand at a contemporary moment when we are so conscious of an LGBTQ movement? So what I really want to get at is where I want to get at now is a third approach, which is the possibility of accessing time through what I call a speculative imagination of the past. I've deliberately chosen the word imagination because, like filmmakers whose works are often, to my mind, very unfairly banned, these artists and practitioners may not be concerned with replicating facts, even though they may draw from them. What this kind of work may achieve instead, I suggest, is a kind of an imagination of an affective and emotional world that conventional historiography may not always access. So it could address gaps and absences, and of course we know that history always has gaps. Through speculation that could actually be based on available but incomplete facts, archival material, or even informal sources of information like memory, which is, of course, we always know it's never so stable, gossip, rumor, hearsay, and so on. This photograph, and now, Aisha, if we can go back to the photograph, I'm really sorry to do this to you, is from, so the next set of photographs are from a body of work called Silent Saga, the next one, that was made into a calendar by Calcutta-based Archan Mukherjee in 2014. These stage tableaus represent his attempt to write the absence of queer subjects into a history of colonial photography. Now, in an interview, Archan said that he was inspired by the idea of found footage, where decontextualized or orphaned images from the past were rediscovered and used by filmmakers. So in these pictures, he tries to capture moments of queer desire, bonding, or intimacy through clues from the past. So these are very staged pictures with friends. Can we have the next picture, Aisha? Where he creates a kind of a gender-bending, portrait. And the next one. that tries to introduce, and this one is the one that you saw earlier, where he tries to introduce the tension of queer repression within the larger context of the movement for independence, which was also a kind of a repression. And the last one in this series. And perhaps the reference in this picture is taken from literary accounts of the zamindars who neglected their many wives. And I guess what he's saying is that could it have been possible for the wives to have found friendship and intimacy with each other? In this sense, Silent Saga becomes a project of writing back and of reinserting one's own subjectivity in the past, but from the vantage point of the present. Can I come back again, Aisha? So my last example focuses on 2 or 3 images created by the celebrated artist from Iran, Azadeh Akhlaqi. Rahab has already spoken about her. This is from her celebrated series By an Eyewitness, 2009 to 12. And she uses these very elaborate staged tableaus, and she revisits through these tableaus the unspoken in the history of Iran, a very violent history, during the years between the Constitutional Revolution of 1906 and the Islamic Revolution in 1979. This was a period that was marked by a lot of instability, but it was also marked by the untimely deaths of many who opposed undemocratic and oppressive regimes in the country. In the absence of officially sanctioned memorialization, her work mediates on moments of death, both accidental and intentional, that may not have been witnessed by the camera. So she's basically going back to these deaths, some of them which may have been intentional, some of them which may have been accidents, some of them which may, where there's a lot of speculation around how the person died, but she revisits these moments of death because she says that there was no camera to witness them, and she goes back and she stages that death. And these cinematic images, she actually worked with Abbas Kiarostami, so they're very, very cinematic images. They move away from the evidential quality of the photograph to access a very affective world of storytelling, where she draws from several references. She's drawing from photographs, she's drawing from, she's in dialogue with literature, she's in dialogue with painting, with the moving image, with, all kinds of images. And she's drawing from very meticulous archival research. But also, as I said before, she's engaging with the fallibility, like Archan, of memory without making claims to historical truth. So in her accounts about time, Azadeh has spoken about gaps, for instance, in visual memories, where people may not remember the exact sequence of events, or they may have a different understanding of a particular event. Let's say 2 people in the same event remembered the event very differently, or they have a heightened recollection of smaller details. So for instance, in a black and white photograph, how is it that sometimes we remember the color of something within that photograph? So, many of them would remember the color of the blood in the photograph, if there was a photograph that existed, or other sensory details which may not be visual. For instance, many of them remembered the way the sun was falling, the way the light was falling, or maybe the breeze that was coming on, or whether they were feeling hot or cold at that moment. In short, her work seeks to access an imagination of the past that sometimes factual information or factual accounts cannot always show. Expressions of interiority, grief, loss, atmosphere, and the intensity and the feeling of the moment. Now, this work is really very complex to explain in 2 minutes or 3 minutes, whatever time I have. But let me point out some ways in which she moves between times. So she works a lot. Aisha, can I have the next image? She works a lot with actors and with non-actors. And so the people that she knows who have similar experiences, often or facial resemblances from the present, often appear in her frames. So, for example, this picture is set in 1940. Of course, it references, painting and all of that by Caravaggio. So it's a mother identifying her son, her communist son, in the morgue, and it's set in 1940. But the face of the mother is referenced from that of Parveen Fahmidi, a very famous activist mother in contemporary Iran, whose son disappeared during the Green Revolution of 2009. Can we just see a picture of Parveen Fahmidi, which is the next one? Yeah, so she's referenced her face when she has used the actor. Can we again have the same image? Aisha, you just need to move to the next slide. So you see the resemblance. Here is another one. If we can move to the next slide, Aisha, where she details the death of a beloved poet in 1924. But the reference that she's using for the positioning of her actress, if you can go to the next image, is from 1970, which is the shootout of students it's a very famous Pulitzer Prize winning photo by John Philo of students against the Vietnam War at the Kent State University in the US. And she actually showed this image to her actor and said, well, this is the kind of thing I want you to do. She, of course, it's another matter that she even gives them dialogues, so it's almost like filming, and these are, of course, still images. There are 17 images in that work, but I want to end by describing only one. Can we move to the next slide, Aisha? Which is the tragic assassination of Hamid Ashraf, who was a young member of a revolutionary organization opposed to the Shah and was killed by his dreaded militia, the Saga, in 1976. Now, Azadeh has spoken in detail about the choreography of this very layered image. Like all her images, there is attention to minute detail. She's added books. You see reflections of clothes and objects. Even the mirror, for instance, has a reflection of clothes that are kind of, they would use these costumes to kind of go out to kind of disguise themselves, fur coats and boots. And, even that, I mean, this is a very low resolution image, so it's difficult to make out, but there is attention to very small objects, the radio and all the kinds of things, they had a sewing machine, they had a mixie in one corner. So all the objects that were in the frame, but there's an interesting way in which she's moving across time. So the books reference the contemporary as well. And the uniforms of the soldiers that we see in the frame are from 3 moments of Iranian history that includes not just the moment in which the killing happened, but the current dispensation as well. Azadeh has also spoken about how eyewitness accounts describe this as a very violent and bloody death, where this commune of young activists was gunned down by a helicopter on the roof. But she has altered this mise-en-scène to one where death was beautiful. And if I can have the next slide, where you see her storyboard, where in her storyboards, where she was planning this image, we see her in different positions, including lying on the ground and looking at the ways in which natural light would frame them. So you can see people lying on the ground, you can see Azadeh outside, all her little jottings and notes, where she actually plans how the light would frame these people. And if we can come back finally to the frame at the end so that you can look at the image again, she reduced the blood, even though this was supposed to be a very bloody image, in terms of eyewitness accounts, she decided that she was going to reduce the blood on her, not have blood on her heroic characters, placing them in positions that gave them dignity. She says that she wanted these tragically martyred young people to look beautiful, almost biblical in death. As a traveler to the past, Azadeh appears in each of her frames. You see her in the mirror in this picture. She's in every one of her frames as a witness to the times that those of her generation were destined to forget. I will conclude with this idea of a kind of a temporality that moves across. I mean, it's a kind of a folded temporality, but I'm going to just end here and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabeena, for that very, very sort of insightful talk into not only the work of Azadeh, of course, but it also presents an interesting idea around photographic tropes, or just the idea of stylization and how much that tempers and conditions the moment. One of the other things, of course, it takes me back to, and I'll just refer to it very quickly, is when you were giving a presentation in the UK, you had also mentioned that particular series of images that was quite complicated during the Bangladesh War, 1971. Maybe we will come back to that later, but it also presented a moment in which things were being performed for camera. Of course, it was a very different kind of a performance over there, and it was a sort of searing, let us say, a remembrance or a commentary on photojournalism itself. But I thought whether there in any capacity is comparable to this given moment, of course, using Azadeh and that moment of 1971. And of course, we're in 2021. So, it's been 50 years. It's a commemorative moment in that sense also, just like Azadeh's images are. I also feel that, there's a certain degree and of self-determination in history. And that's the sort of extremely productive part of what you've tried to express through the work of Mukherjee, through those sort of reconstructed images of his own kinds with the vintage archive. But that sort of takes me, of course, now to Anusha and the sort of self-generative capacity of an image, the regenerative capacity of an archive that the Memory Project itself has triggered. And of course, the contingencies of that now, at a time where what one remembers at this moment, how one signposts the past, and how one literally creates an archive for the future. What does one put in there, and how does one actually deal with the various classificatory terms and the classificatory modes in which one is sort of engaged with image making and construction today, especially at a time of what, Anusha, I saw you doing the other day on Instagram, which we talked about, was engaging with deep fakes through another app. But I thought this was a good moment to transition into then your piece. So please, after you.
Hi, thank you, Rahab. Thank you, Sabeena, for your talk as well. I mean, both of you have already referenced things that I'm going to be also include in this conversation. So there is clearly an overlap. Avid, thank you for inviting me for this conversation. I'm going to share my screen. So I'm assuming that everybody who is on this, who are the viewers, know about Indian Memory Project. And if you don't, please go ahead to indianmemoryproject.com to see what it's about, and that should give you a context. Because what I'm going to be talking about here is not the projects, what does it do, and what it can, what it has been doing, but I want to start, as I had discussed with Rahab also, is talk about the present. And the present, and then, as he said, to look back and forth is how these archives are negotiating themselves with the present moment, as well as the past and the future that we do not know anything about. So here we are in 2021, after a year of our options and lives and work and everything and on an impasse, and then it gives us some time to think about what we've been working on. So just to, I'm going to do the same thing like Sabeena. I also have written down something, so I might look at another screen. So please bear with that. So I just want to give a snapshot of what's happening right now in the world of photography per se, or the photographs that we see. Approximately 3.5 trillion photographs have been taken since the famous picture of the thoroughfare, almost 2 centuries ago. And in 2020 alone, we have taken 1.4 trillion photographs, half of which have been photographed over 2 centuries in one single year. And 300 billion images of what has been taken have been uploaded to the internet. And this number is estimated to rise at about 12% a year. So it should come to no one's surprise. And I just want to add to that little segue just as a comparative that according to archaeology mathematicians, of all people that have ever lived on this planet, including infant mortality rate, is 110 billion. And of which only 7% are alive right now. So we have more photographs than we've ever had lives, human lives on this planet. And so it basically should, I've been thinking about this, that it should come to us no surprise that we, along with the habit of doom scrolling, are also experiencing a fatigue of images. And for archivists of the future, it's going to be a big task to go through all the images that are being uploaded as to what they're going to keep, what they're going to remove, what they're going to ignore, because lest they forget a detail of some kind. And I have been also looking at things like the gaps and the absence of images, and why is there a nostalgia about certain ideas and there is no nostalgia about certain past, or there is no yearning for the past per se. And the thing is about the past is that we only try and remember it. We only want to remember our past, whether it is a national past or a past of other things, is when there are transitions taking place in the collective or in your own personal life. Is that, for example, maturing into adulthood, or if there is an alienation within a country, or if there is extreme technological progress. And that is what happened around the 1980s in the Western Hemisphere, at least, because the British sociologist Paul Connaughton terms it the memory boom, is that the phenomena that occurs within a public that fears a loss of memory. And the same thing happened a decade or so later within the Indian subcontinent and the onset of the internet, opening our doors with the FDI investments to the world, and the sudden explosion of accessible technology, that we began to sense our own amnesia of what we had forgotten and what we must share with the rest of the world. And that led to the birth of archives such as Indian Memory Project, among others. And also, it sort of renewed and refreshed the lives of already existing archives who could now do something more with all of that. What is different from 2000s to from this ever since the onset of the internet or technology within the subcontinent and 2021 is that people assume that archives now exist on social media. They don't exist on social media. They are just referencing something that already exists somewhere else. And it creates like advertising a knowledge of the existence. And but it does create an overwhelming amount of pressure to learn, to know, and it's a performance of memory over and over again that causes and is causing a lot of fatigue. Also, there is, I think, currently a sense that there is no fear of loss, no fear of loss of memory, and so therefore we can keep taking it for granted that it exists. Fortunately, archives do just that. They do fill in the gaps of loss, of whatever we can find, of all the other, whether it's images, letters, documents, media, or any other material. That is what archives do, and that they protect or they preserve of some kind. Uh, but given how short our lifetime is, none of us can document, for example, the Indian subcontinent past, let alone the planet. There's a lot of information. There is too much. But what I think about, and I'm going to really get into, is that what I think about are the gaps and the gaps of what is actually not there. And this time in the last year or 2 years, I have actually sat seriously to think about what is not there, because and what is not being said, and that is what is of interest to me. So I look at it, whether you look at it through areas of basically scale. So Indian Memory Project actually obviously has two time scales, if you wanted to look at time as an aspect of looking at an archive. And it is basically, yes, from the late 19th century to today, which is that you have 200 years of because of photography, and photography is a central contextual tool in the project. And the other is through the narrative, which comes attached, which stretches itself across 4 to 5 centuries. So people will refer to 17th century, maybe this happened, or the 13th century, this happened, and they can keep referencing that kind of history. And if it's documented already, great. If it's not, it is still just a reference at the time is stretchable between for the photograph and the narrative quite interestingly. And by virtue of being alive and generative, it offers endless meanings and re-meanings and reinterpretations over time that hold unpredictable and predictable signifiers of collective behaviors or collective attitudes. And which is exactly what Rahab was saying, that while we can do whatever, we are still a partial memory. It doesn't matter how small or big we become, there will always be something that gets left behind. And that's also fine, because we don't have to, in my opinion, document every single thing. There is something called the right to forget, and we are also okay with something of that sort. But especially when it comes to subjects like conflict, trauma, taboos, and I feel that personally, not much of that has been documented. And not much of that has been documented because for me, we are attempting to we're looking at things of how we got where we have gotten here. How did we get here? What has led to certain situations in our past in the last few years taking place that has led us to believe that it was all a surprise, or why is all of this happening? But I believe that there are reasons why a lot of this is happening. And so I wanted to show around 4 pieces of the ideas of the kind of what I feel is the absence of, in the case of Memory Project, absence of evidence is indeed evidence of absence. And so I'm interested in looking at adding and researching more stories that what people are not talking about, or they do not want to share, and why do they not want to share ideas like that. For example, these are 4 kinds of conflicts and traumas and taboos that people began to speak about, and that does not, unfortunately, they cannot bear the burden of the entire subject, but it touches upon things that I'm deeply interested in investigating. For example, this picture is offered by Zach Gifford, who's written about how his grandmother Joan was born in Ranchi in 1930, but illegitimately. And now illegitimacy is something that has been, and to some extent even now, considered to be something of an idea of shame, of family shame. And but the beauty of the story was how it actually became about acceptance and beauty and respect, and that also shows a change in people's attitudes compared to how it was in the past. But considering so there's some research around the 17th century, so starting from the 17th century, that almost one of every sixth child was illegitimate. That's a lot of shame for families to have carried around, and a lot of stuff that was not discussed, or things that were buried under the carpet. And it's okay to not talk about it, but the ones where it can make a difference, I think it's a beautiful thing to start talking about the things that don't hold any weight in the current form. But that's one of the things. And it also acknowledges, what it does is that it acknowledges what we have as a subcontinent experience, and to acknowledge and heal from those failures of society. And this is what stories and images like that offer that opportunity to connect with, and therefore think about and do something with those ideas. This, for example, is another form of community conflict, which was about the insurgent military in the 1970s in Punjab. And Punjab is not new to trauma and fears and bloodshed and violence. But it also just reiterates that we have to again look at our own actions as society and the actions of the oppressors, and see how do we deal with conflict and displacement and alienation within a country that we all actually are very proud of to be a part of, but yet how do we fix these little alienations that people feel quite strongly, so much so that they become part of an archive, is something that we need to investigate. Because one story cannot bear the burden of the whole narrative of this, so to speak. The third story is also an interesting one. This is also about international conflict, and how one person stories throws light and on the entire world politics that was happening all at once during the 1940s, whether it was the Nazi regime, or whether it was Russia, whether it was wars in Africa, or whether it was India's fight for independence. I mean, there was a lot going on at this time, but this person has witnessed almost all of it because of his outreach as well as engagement with figures that were of consequence in that time. But it also shows things like little kept secrets, where he founded a not so very well known secret army that was founded by Subhash Chandra Bose, even though not agreeing with Bose's philosophy completely, but went and joined him and helped him build this army, who were actually prisoners of war in the Nazi regime, and to build a small army just because they shared the same goal of independence. And this also just sheds light of, there was so much going on during that time that we only tend to focus on India's independence, but there was so much going around at that goings on at that time that it's quite flabbergasting that there were multiple histories that if you were to flesh them out, they would reveal a very different story than what is shown or written in official quote-unquote histories of nations. And so therefore my agenda or my purpose is actually to find more evidence of presence as far as the memory project is concerned, and not be affected by a memory fatigue, which I can assure you also affects me. And that I have to work within the disciplined utopia of trying to do as much as I can, because I really think that breakthroughs happen when we are in a utopian sense, looking at an ideal form of future, of great access, of great sharing. And yes, that there will be reinterpretations, there will be meanings of meanings of meanings, and how the future will look at it, like Rahab correctly said, can be completely appropriated and misappropriated at the same time, depending on whose hands these archives fall into eventually. Uh, and so I have actually, these are the four. The fourth one is something that is quite close to my heart because I've thought about this since I was a child. That there were two countries who've experienced the same trauma, who've experienced the same pain. And here we are 75 years later. My mother was born in 1947, she's 75. That's a whole lifetime on one person. And how these traumas, they don't go away because the political will does not let us heal and does not offer us spaces to heal, unless they are being created by citizens themselves, which is something that I feel that we need to do a lot more about. And so this is where I am in this area. I've been also thinking about people who are starting new archives, and some conversations with them are very interesting because what is happening is, while there are fractures and there are alienations and distortions within society happening right now, but that is also, I find, coloring the eyes of people who want to be archivists, because they have a judgment about what life is right now and how they want to be politically active or politically take a side of somebody or to give space to marginalized communities, which is all fair. But I think as archivists, we have to see all sides. I would say maintain a neutral territory because we are witnesses, we are not judges of how a certain era should be seen or a certain time should be seen. And this is with this, I sort of just take you on to what's been Rahab was mentioning is happening. And these are the kind of things I engage with, mainly because I'm interested in how old images and photographs are being used or appropriated, again, misappropriated, both whether for the good or bad. This is still remains to be seen. And technology, as far as I can tell, and I think maybe everybody else can, that it's a moving target. People are trying out new things to see if you can understand our past more. Like this, for example, this deep fake, and I will show you something quite interesting, which is that this, I don't know if this moves. And these are animated images developed by an artificial intelligence. The effect is not quite human, it's very Harry Potter. Both the tech creator, it's an Israeli company called DID, as well as My Heritage app, which started this thing that went viral on their app. Nobody claims that this has some kind of, truth to it, but we live in an era of disinformation, and it is possible that people get deceived, and how this technology will be used in the future remains to be seen. Will Memory Project include this? Not yet, not for a while, until we see that what happens with this. And with that, I sort of end this conversation about where we stand in the future or the present. Because as far as I'm concerned, the work on Memory Project, we need to be patient, resilient. Everything is going to change as it always has changed. I'm just grateful that the website that accommodates Indian Memory Project only evolves. It doesn't completely change itself drastically every few years. And that we have to negotiate these waters more calmly and more patiently, and let not the memory fog around the world around us really affect us that much, even though it will be hard. The archive, I can assure you, will endure. Any archive will endure. All an archive needs, whether it's clay tablets from Egypt that is being used by NASA, to smaller archives in the future, is that we have the will to remember. That's it.
Thank you, Anusha, for that riveting talk, actually. And it's so wonderful to see, and particularly you ending with those images sort of recalls the idea of how fiction itself can lead us to look at reality and, of course, explore more about reality than sometimes the documented image itself does. So many thoughts coming to the fore, so significant actually, I feel personally, to think about all of those elided areas of interest that you have just brought to light, especially at a time of a kind of xenophobic toxicity and supremacist ideology. I mean, this is the time to actually think about and to invoke sort of moments that need restitution from complete erasure. I think that's so significant. In your example of someone who is, of course, revolutionary, brings to mind the kind of imagery that also exists that I've seen in another place about the Gadar party, and sort of societies that were being built at the time. What I found fascinating, of course, is so many of the images that you showed were studio images. They were taken in that moment where one is sort of preparing, to sort of live out the terms of one's existence through the taking of a studio photograph.
It's going to come back. Studio photography is going to make a big comeback as we speak.
I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will. And it's also something that brings me to the terms on which our next speaker engages with, which is the difference, the going from the studio to the street, as it were. And that is also such a significant, let's say, transformation that signified a kind of new shift in what photography was trying to do from the pre to the post, of course, independence times. And this has been talked about extensively as well. But to use a phrase that Sabeena actually came up with respect to Homai, the lady in the rough crowd, I would like to ask and invite Janaki Subramanyam, who has been taking photographs in Bombay on the streets for the last several years, and sort of her engagement with the subject, her engagement with people, her sort of personal engagement with them over a period of time is something that has really struck out, not only in other popular press sort of outlets, but also, I think, significantly to tell us about engagements with the subject in front of the lens. Maybe the sort of terms on which we engage with people who are on the other side is something that we need to be more sensitized to or continue to be sensitized to at this moment in time. So Janaki, without further delay, look forward to your presentation, please.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to start off by thanking the team of having me this platform. And a big thank you to everyone for watching this first Zoom discussion panel. It's really overwhelming. So I'd like to talk about how photography has always been a very sacred medium. Very well presented by Anusha and Sabeena about how photography has been used to document lives, to bring a social change, or just as a medium of self-exploration or self-expression. Particularly, photography has been really special because it has the stories, retrace the past, and also give insights about the future. I think in today's time, as we know, a lot of people have transitioned, including me, but there are a bunch of us who still have a soft corner analog photography. And that's what makes this talk really special, because I'm going to bring insights on not by technical aspects of composition, but about how these pictures make us feel and what does it really inspire people for. So in a world where everything passes by in a split second, the process of shooting and developing film really makes us want to slow down and maybe acknowledge some very simple everyday things that are around us. So I have curated a list of images as a part of my presentation. Some of which were a part of one of my most favorite projects that I did. That was Bombay on film. And I will be talking in detail about the elements of which will involve very basic things like light, shadow, patterns, textures, and these simple things that I'm drawn to and that eventually create pictures. Photography for me is not about the camera per se, or the type of camera per se, but it's more about what's beyond the camera and everything that surrounds the camera. Voices you hear when you're shooting, the visuals you see around the subject that you're probably shooting, what was going on in your mind, right? So there are several factors to creating the final product that most of you see on social media or this person's content anywhere. It's a form of meditation and self expression to me. I am not that great with words. So for me, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm anxious, I photograph. And photographing the world has really helped me put my emotions out there and maybe help connect people who feel the same. So I leave this open to interpretation, but I'd like to pick certain pictures and explain to you the challenges I faced while I shot these pictures and everything that I felt while I took them. So this is a simple cover image for my presentation, and it's capturing time through photography. Let's get to it, right? All right, the first image on the left. This is one of my personal favorites from the past. Very simple. It's something that is so close to my heart because I took this during college time when I was not doing so well in life, and I used to just take my camera out to kind of vent out my emotions. And this is one of the first few pictures I shot. This boy looking at the skyline, probably aspiring to be something, really meant so much to me. And the little reflection of his feet on that platform on the side gave so much character to this image. So this is something that really struck me at that moment, and I have to show. Also, there are a lot of times when you don't want to directly face a subject. Take that subject and connect it to the environment and you feel. That's one of my favorites. And on the right is a picture that I shot in Toledo in Spain when I was there for my training. And I realized that I did a lot of solo traveling to places where there weren't so many people. And I usually love shooting street where I have a lot of people to add depth to my pictures. But then I started understanding the meaning of light and shadow patterns that add a different kind of a story to pictures. So I remember exploring one of the cathedrals where I happened to find this beautiful pattern of this tile work on the other side and the light seeping through to create this beautiful pattern. So this also happens to be one of my favorites. Let's go to the next. All right, the one on the left. Many a times when you are in a very dark street or you're in places where you feel a little demotivated by you cannot get the right light to capture things, you must look out for certain messages, certain signs, and things that you really attract, you will end up seeing. So I remember I was in Delhi. This is shot in Chandra, and even though it was afternoon and we had harsh light, I was in one of those lanes where it was dark and dingy. I happened to see this guy wearing this t-shirt or shirt that said "Wish Me Luck." And coincidentally, I was going through a pretty rough phase back then. And all of my thoughts started to come out. And I think this is how I presented the picture. And I coincidentally found this frame. This also happens to be one of my favorite pictures. And on the right-hand side is a staged picture. But I think one of my most favorite ones because this I shot when I lost my pet. Happens to be one of the closest ones. And I could not, express my loss through words. So I took my camera out and I just shot for months together. And the one thing that he taught me, my pet, I had a dog. The one thing that he taught me was to just live in the moment, just be present wherever you are, and that's all that counts. And this particular building is shot in. This is in Grant Road in Bombay. It's a restaurant called Happiness or a cafe called Happiness. And I had this little time, pocket watch with me. So I just staged this image to, get my idea out into visuals. So this is also one of the ways where you can really express without having to, find or search for meaning. You can go to the next one. All right. So black and white happens to be one of my most favorite, mediums because a lot of times with color you have many choices to express. Black and white, there's so much of character and it tells stories that probably colors count sometimes. And it talks emotions, it talks feelings. The picture on the left was shot in Curator. Like I said earlier, I was solo traveling, and I happened to see this couple hold each other and walk through the rain. And even though those streets were super empty that time, and I didn't really find it exciting to shoot, I felt lonely while I was there, and I happened to spot people, and it just made it everything. Rather than just a picture of some architecture, I feel it added some life to it. Picture on the right is a black and white shot of the waves hitting land. So I very recently shot in Gokarna. I had traveled there with a friend, and we were really tired and exhausted. But somehow the surroundings helped us calm down. So the sound of waves calmed us down and gave us a sense of peace, which helped us, kept going further. And I love how the waves are really, they add so much life to the image. Let's go to the next one. Okay. I shot the left and the picture on the right very recently on a Roro boat from Bombay to Alibag. And this is one of the best examples that I can give you of self-expression, because I wasn't in a very great state that time, and I happened to express through these pictures. The ones that you see flying behind me, they're all seagulls. And it was really hard to focus given the light and the massive exposure that I had that day. But this is actually a reflection on the left, and on the right, it's just the endless sea and the very hard to focus seagulls. But this is one of, I think, the most important pictures to me, because it was a sense of freedom that I wanted. It was a meditative state that I wished for, that I probably couldn't get. But through my lens, I could create this, and eventually I found my space. And right. So the picture shot on the left is actually shot at the other Parsi colony in Bombay. And it is so crazy that this particular place is so peaceful. And 100 meters ahead to walk, you find the loudest streets of Dadar, and you wouldn't even imagine that a beautiful colony like this ever exists. So there's also one of my favorite images where they're just everyday, mundane things that we overlook most of the time because we're so busy with our lives. Uh, like I said, the whole process of shooting on film, just photographing the world, makes one slow down and kind of appreciate the everyday things we see. Just reading his paper, probably doing his fun of this. The image on the right, it's a little faded on this presentation. However, this was shot in Hajeli, and this is when I truly believed in minimalism and the less is more concept, where you don't need 100 subjects to make your picture loud. And here we have the lady in the local train, and on the left is someone, this particular guard who actually still happens to be there in Bombay with a split screen. And I absolutely think that elements like this involve more meaning to pictures. So something that we could actually use. Let's go to the next one. Okay. I love this picture on the left because it shows a lot of contrasting personalities. This is Bombay and monsoons. We all know, like, there are a bunch of us who absolutely love the rains and a bunch of us who dread them. So I kind of got both of them in the same, and that also adds a lot of that. One on the right is just a very simple street picture of these vendors in Grant Road. You find them at the best of their moods early morning. So that's my most favorite time to go and shoot street. So that's, again, one of the pictures on the left, again, is just depicts a lot of simplicity. I connect a lot with people that I shoot. So I happen to actually interact with these kids walking from school. It was really nice. And on the right, I shot this at the Parsi colony, the other colony cafe. And this one thing that I'd like to highlight, you see the series of 3 images. If we go to the next one, the next picture. Right. So they're basically a family of father, daughter, and son. And I wanted to photograph them in their element. So as much as the lady was really enthusiastic, and so was the father, her brother was really reluctant. So there are, times when you find other parallel spaces to shoot things that probably would restrict. So like if you see on the image on the right hand side, I have a mirror on the left. So I try to get the brother's reflection, the both including in my picture. So these are just small things that, I think you eventually learn to create as when you keep practicing. And all right, so this last picture shot in Spain, it was exactly my mind put into a visual, which was just in a very chaotic state. Where in sometimes, in spite of being in a really crowded space, you feel like you can't get your thoughts together, you have no one to express to. So in such times, the medium of photography help me to output my thoughts. So there's this again one of those pictures. So yes, I'd like to conclude my presentation by just saying a few words about the fact that photography should be dealt with the way you feel and not what you see. And that would probably create a massive difference. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Janaki, for your presentation. It's really quite lovely to see those images. And I also I particularly resonate with the one in which you were on the boat and going across to Alibag. There's, of course, a reason for that. And one of them is in this last exhibition that I had curated called Look Stranger. Look Stranger is actually a poem by Auden. And it goes so that he's kind of looking out at sea, he's standing on the shore. And it sort of presents to him a moment of estrangement and a moment of excitement at the same time of what he's about to encounter, and a strangeness that is also part of that experience. But of course, the sense that he brings out is that one should embrace strangeness and one should embrace a moment of uncertainty, because those two lead to the production of knowledge and new encounters. It's kind of quite poetic and beautiful in that way. It also makes me realize or think about, what Sabeena was talking about a little earlier, how there were these immense amounts of camera clubs that came out in the post-independence period. I guess they were pre-independence if you think of photographic societies, but they kind of went into post-independence. And they, Sabeena, if I'm not mistaken, wielded a great amount of power. One of the exhibitions that I think came about at this moment, maybe in the late 50s, if I remember correctly, on which I know very little and there's not much out there, was called Images of India. I think it was done in parallel to, or rather just after, the Family of Man show visited Bombay in the mid-1950s, and then of course traveled around to various cities, including Delhi and Chennai. It sort of makes me come to this notion of pictorialism, Sabeena, that you had touched upon, the whole idea of performativity. And quite simply, looking at Janaki's talk, and of course also on yours, we've come to this tenuous arena once again of the documentary meeting and arts practice. I just wanted to ask you, when you sort of engage with your students today, as you do, what are some of the things you tell them about the sort of two so-called polarized modes of the documentary and art actually coming together today and forming what you very rightly sort of termed as speculative encounters? Could you speak a little more to that for the audience?
Thanks a lot, Rahab. I'm going to be very brief because I know we've got very little time, but I actually noticed that was one of the questions in the chat as well. So it'll be nice because I'll be addressing that as well. So I just wanted to say that the lines in documentary are today very blurred. In fact, we prefer to use the word nonfiction. We actually don't use, we try, because, the word documentary, people use the word documentary, but documentary has such a great association with fact and with document. Whereas the idea of the non-fiction today has become a much more fluid and open term that could incorporate fictive elements as well. And so many of our students I teach photography at times, but I actually teach the moving image. That's really what, and of course we know that there's this blurring of lines between the still and the moving image. But we try and show our students a variety of for instance, if you look at Azade's work, it's drawing from documentary, it's drawing from facts, but it is not trying to present these facts as as something which is written in stone, because we know that history itself has been challenged. We know that historical fact itself, history is an interpretation.
Yeah.
Let's put it this way: history is always an interpretation of certain kinds of facts. Which is why I'm saying that documentary itself is a more fluid term today. Nonfiction is a more fluid term that could use fictive elements to tell the story. I'm going to give you a very quick example. We have a student film that has just been made, which wanted to situate their film, which was based on the kind of encounter killings that you have in, let's say, Kashmir. Now, given the times, it's very difficult to do a film like that. And they decided that a documentary would have been out of the question. So they chose to make a film based on a real story, but they made it into a fiction film, but they set it in another time. We are talking about moving between times. They decided to set that story, the same story of the encounter killing, in the times of Punjab. Just after the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi and after the Chief Minister Bien Singh was assassinated. And it is exactly the same kind of thing that would happen, but they basically extrapolated that story from Kashmir to Punjab and been able to tell that story with much greater ability. So that's really what I'm trying to get at.
Thank you. That sort of takes us into the sphere in which, I suppose at this point of time, when historicity itself is something that is being looked at through the eyes of something evidentiary on the one hand, but also, what you're intimating is a kind of forensic insight into the work. How do you sort of access history? By looking at all that's really around it and part of it associationally. And this is exactly, I think, the analysis that one puts to the science of image making and construction can never exactly in the same way be applied to the science of let's say, recounting the past, because it's through trace, it's through, I guess, snippets, if one could call it that. But these snapshots, the everyday, the momentary, is also something, the ephemera, is also something that is complicating, our sense of that monolithic history. And it's come to the fore so interestingly in the last, I suppose, decade or more. The place of the personal, the place, therefore, of the personal in the political, and henceforth. With that kind of tenor, I wanted to ask you, Anusha, once again, and I think it kind of resonates from some of the questions that are being asked. You've taken a kind of conceptual shift in, as it were, into your practice of what the Memory Project can and should do from here on, forwards. This shift has to do something with movements in technology and media, but it also has to do with, let's say, a socio-political, cultural shift that requires this, making of new histories or unearthing of untold histories to occur at this moment in time. I just wanted to press you a little more on those conceptual shifts that are occurring within the Memory Project. Have you, thought then about transposing all that the Memory Project is doing within the subcontinent to globalizing that sphere? Because what you're actually doing is looking at global histories. You're looking at global encounters. You're sort of you're actually making us aware of a new cartography called memory, which no longer can be, just restricted to the subcontinental history of, as it were, India, but branches out well beyond it. What are the challenges, actually, of that transposition, that move and that broadening, which is so possible and something that you're very much on the cusp of already? And I say this, of course, while thinking of diaspora, what is called diaspora, but really, with respect to migrations that are taking place in the present. And of course, having said that, all of us being migrants, also, settling in this place, which is what so beautifully comes out in the Memory Project. One's commitment to place, one's association with space is also something which is constantly in transition. And I suppose if there is something called identity, something as nebulous as identity, then it is your commitment to your practice that gives you that identity in a way. And your commitment to a practice is memory, the fluid space of the subconscious and the real. And so what are the challenges of doing this Because I suppose when you come to a space like the Memory Project, the site that is the Memory Project, you have to begin to structure that in some way. It's a kind of new structural element that you have to bring in vis-a-vis the changes that you are making. So just a few ideas from you about how you might make that shift structurally for the Memory Project.
The interesting part is that when the idea of Memory Project in my head made sense 10 years ago, or sorry, 12 years ago, I knew I could do a World Memory Project. It was the same idea that could be applied to anything. But I stopped short of one, it was extremely overwhelming to do that. Number two, I found I was better situated to do Indian subcontinent. One, because there was not much of it in public domain per se, with access to everybody. Plus it was a place I understood. I could read between the lines. I could ask. I had access to friends who could help me read between the lines. Now, and so therefore, it was much easier for me to contain it to that space rather than throw myself open to a lot. That was hard and overwhelming. So yeah, but the thing is, it was also interesting because at that time there were archives like Saga, which is based in the US, or there are archives in London. There are different archives trying to do the same thing, and it was interesting because at the same time when Memory Project did started being talked about, is that when a lot of people starting their own archives based on the similar idea or inspired by it. But I thought it was better to tell everybody how to do it without any monetary gain or any ego or any of that. That was my way of actually doing a global memory project rather than trying to do it all by myself. Because it was much more effective for me to collaborate. It was much easier to have access to an inter-archive, so to speak, in the future rather than do it at that moment, at that time, immediately. And yeah, so I did. I mean, that was you can do it for one city. You can do it for the whole world. It's quite a scalable idea. And
yeah, no, absolutely. It totally is. And it sort of also makes one think about, what exactly it is that will globalize.
Hence, just to add also, which is why I added a term saying I did not want to limit the contributions from Indians only. It was as long as there is an experience of the subcontinent, it is going to welcome the story. And all I needed was people to touch upon this area, and then wherever you come from, it doesn't matter.
No, thank you. That's those touch points are the ones that I think eventually take us into signposting our ideas across disciplinary fields, signposting our ideas across area studies. I've been talking again to the pedagogy that also supports and often belies a lot of these interdisciplinary modes, intermedia modes, and what you've called inter-archive modes. It's nice to think about that. Talking of inter-archives, the refrain, the overwhelming refrain in our talks is also towards the analog. So on this front, Janaki, I wanted to ask you a little bit about this. At this moment, as one is in the throes of social media, the complicated throes of social media, I would say, and where one is almost as a reflex, opinionating at all times, also sharing images of the self and others at all times. And one is in the so-called, but not so much really, threat of being consumed by images, the surfeit of images. One questions what will matter. One questions what really becomes significant in the process of image taking and making. And of course, we've learned through various photographers, various sort of historians, or various individuals who think around image practice is that there are various filters of time, various sort of engagements that take place, which draw us back to history and to maybe what is going to outlast the terms of its making. And I bring this up with respect to your particular interest in analog project or analog photography, because somehow, having seen this develop also at this moment in time, that is somehow digital practice, social media has invoked analog back into our presence, and what you call slowing down in order to see the world, slowing down in order to make an image, really be responsible for constructing that. I just wanted to ask you if you could share ideas about maybe some of the processes that you really enjoy in going back to the analog, and whether you feel, social media and digital culture has really brought back an interest in the handmade to an extent, please.
That's a huge question. I think what really takes me back is the fact that it is so raw and it's so organic that it really brings you down to basics that digital media, or rather digital cameras, don't actually allow you. The thing about film is that it's all come back again because we have digital tools to enable us to kind of spread the word. So I think, like we had this discussion the other day, is that it's important to coexist, which is why it's the way to revive old memories and all of that. Also, digital cameras have its own place, and cameras have its own place. Being a practitioner of both, I use my iPhone to take pictures, and then I use my analog on times and sheet to slow down and explore a little more about my capability and the things that I can do with them, or I can create with them. That's just one thing I feel about film, because what happens is you have 36 exposures and 36 chances with each film. You're kind of forced to think about composition and lighting and what you actually in. So that's just one of the things I feel really fortunate to have learned with the analog. And nowadays we see on platforms like Instagram where you have filters to make things look vintage, to give them a really old feel. So these are the things that we organically create with our analog cameras. Tell stories and document.
Thank you.
Rahab,
Go ahead.
Can I just quickly come in? So I was just thinking of what she was saying, what Janaki was saying, and I was just thinking that, there's so much of this stuff, and I'm sure Anusha knows that too, of stuff that is, when you were talking about the deep fakes, that connects with that too, that, even when you have so-called archival historical photographs circulating on the net, you're not quite sure which version you're looking at and how many of them have been kind of altered, changed, cropped. So it's also like, this whole idea of the net as an archive is also so questionable, because yes, it's a wonderful space to get stuff and to get images. And yet there are all these different things that seem to be from the past. And this whole question of authenticity is something that I just want to signpost, because what is authentic? I mean, that's a question mark that we all need to ask. What will be an authentic fact? Who will decide what is an authentic fact? Who will decide what is an authentic photograph? Because it's very tough. And I guess only an archivist of the kind that the two of you are, I mean, the two of you run archives. I mean, Rahab runs an archive. You have an archive, where you're getting pictures from people, would be able to kind of authenticate, say that this is actually authentic. But other than that, I'm not sure that this question of authenticity is something that, let's say the jury is out on that, really. That's what I would
But
say.
it's also to look at the internet not as an archive but as bookmarks. I mean, that is how I have decided in my head that I need to search something. I will just feed it and it's there. That's a bookmark. It's not an archive.
Yeah,
they know. It's just a jungle of Hi, Asad.
Offshot the time, and sorry, Rahab, do you want to just wrap it up, and I'll do my vote of thanks?
Of course, I'm happy to do so. But thank you, Anusha, Janaki, Sabeena, for those wonderful talks. I almost feel we're sort of at the precipice of a very interesting moment. It only brings to mind one quote, which was Julia Margaret Cameron, who said we should all take chances. She said, "Leap and the net will come." And that is exactly that, something that one has to do, I suppose, in the present, with believing in a future that can be different from our present in a sense. Of course, when she said "leap and the net will come," she didn't know about the internet. However, taking that as a tone for what is to come, I think one of the questions, I'll sort of end with that, that is being asked through the questionnaire, which is, on our sort of computers, is, in a way, what is the expectation now of an image? I think that is something that is key. And authenticity, I think, really flows beautifully into that notion. And it also highlights for me this one particular referencing, again, from Jeffrey Patchen's book, where he mentions that already in 1850, people were taking photographs of paintings and circulating them, and they actually were more than the paintings out there. And so this whole question of what was, the real object, the actual object, the artifactual, I suppose led us to this question of authenticity and authorship to a great extent. And I think that is the overdetermination of authorship is something that is also being questioned at the moment. And I think this is why the idea of shared intelligences, this is why the idea of collectives, maybe the idea of formations at this point of time is interesting, because they can share and cross-share from one another, so that we don't come to that moment of a singularity of what authenticity or authorship may or may not be. Of course, this is to be discussed to a great extent, but I think it's also something that really invokes this idea of what the image was and what the singularity was. And now, Sabeena, as you mentioned, coming to moving image with the durational, with the elongation, one is really questioning what moment in time will really be representative of time in the end. So with that, Asad, I give it back to you.
Thank you, Rahab, for so skillfully moderating this conversation. What was I thinking? I mean, giving an hour and a half for a topic like capturing time through photography with such a stellar, I would like to use the word rock star, but that may not go quite well with, but anyway, it's just we've got so much ground to cover. We've got so many questions unanswered. So I'm going to request our panelists, if I'm going to kind of overstep their good graces by asking them if they would answer them by email to us, and we'll kind of share the answers, because I know we've not got to our Q&A section, but this is what happens when images speak more than words. And but thank you very much for your contributions, the panel, and also to our audiences for tuning in such large numbers. Our next session is on the female agency in art next Thursday on the 11th of March. Until then, just stalk us on social media, follow us at Avid Learning, our website, and be safe, be healthy, and remember that learning never stops. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good night. Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.